Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going behind the scenes of U.S. Navy diving operations.
And we're not talking about the dives themselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're diving into their logs and reports. It's a world most people don't even know exists.
I'll admit, when I first saw the stack of manuals and instructions we have for this deep dive, I thought, okay, how exciting can diving logs be? But I've got to say, I was really wrong.
Yeah, it's not just paperwork, is it? These records are crucial for safety, for spotting trends, even protecting the divers themselves.
But whoa, there's a whole story here.
Definitely. A story that's evolved over years and years.
Okay, so every dive gets logged, right? That's
Yep.
going to be a starting point.
You got it. Each command keeps a command dive log plus a recompression chamber log. So every single dive, every chamber operation, it all gets recorded, creating like this complete history for that command.
So it's like a super detailed project log, but for diving. What kind of details are we talking about?
Everything you can imagine. Dates, times, why they're diving, who the divers are, how deep they go, how long they're down there, what decompression procedures they use, all the equipment. It's all in there.
Wow, that's meticulous. I bet if something goes wrong, those logs are the first thing investigators look at.
Absolutely. And speaking of things going wrong, even temporary dives with another command get logged twice. Once for the diver's home command, once for the host command. Accountability, got to have a complete record no matter what.
Makes sense. No room for anything to slip through the cracks. But it's not just about documenting the dives themselves, right? There's got to be a whole system for reporting and analyzing that data.
You're right. All that info from the logs feeds into the Dive Jump Reporting System, or DJRS, and that goes straight to the Naval Safety Center.
So it's like big data, but for diving safety. I'm picturing someone, crunching numbers, looking for patterns, those red flags that might mean a safety issue is about to pop up.
Exactly. They analyze trends, find potential problems, and then boom, they share that info with the entire fleet to prevent similar incidents. It's really proactive, and it's made a huge difference.
So it's not just reacting after accidents happen. They're using all that data to try and prevent them in the first place.
Exactly. But it's not just about preventing those big accidents either. The Navy really encourages reporting even near misses through a system called HAZ reps, which are hazard reports.
Interesting. So even a near miss can be a valuable learning experience.
Totally. Imagine a diver goes a little deeper than they're supposed to, but their buddy catches it and corrects the situation. No harm done, and still, something to report and analyze.
Makes sense. You want to know what led to it, how they responded, the whole thing.
Exactly. So it's about creating this culture where even those close calls are taken seriously. I bet some of those reports would be pretty intense to read.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And what's really interesting is that self-reporting a near miss, it's actually seen as like a mark of professionalism in the diving community. It shows you're committed to learning and improving safety for everyone.
That's a really cool perspective. It takes guts to admit a mistake, even if it didn't lead to something terrible.
It does. It really shows how important a proactive safety culture is to the Navy. But of course, sometimes things do go wrong. That's when the whole mishap reporting system swings into action.
And from what I've read, the Navy does not mess around when it comes to mishaps. What happens when a reportable mishap occurs?
First things first, secure the equipment. No tampering allowed. Got to preserve everything for the investigation. No one touches it until the investigators get there.
I can see why, especially if the equipment itself might be part of what caused the mishap. So what happens next? Immediate reporting. Got to get the word out fast. They use the Web-Enabled Safety System, or WES-ES, for that. Make sure everyone up the chain of command knows what's going on right away.
So it's like, boom, get that information out there. But what exactly is in that initial report?
The basics. Date, time, where it happened, the type of dive they were doing, who was involved, what happened leading up to the mishap, and then a detailed account of the mishap itself.
Okay, so the bare bones, but there's got to be more to it than that.
Right. That initial report is just the beginning. Then they put together a much more in-depth written report. I mean, every single detail you can think of goes in that report.
Like what kind of details are we talking about here?
Witness statements, photos, diagrams, even the weather and water conditions. Anything that could be relevant, it's all in there.
Wow, that's thorough. Why go to all that trouble? It sounds like a ton of work.
It is. But remember, the Navy's goal isn't to find someone to blame. They want to learn from these incidents and keep them from happening again. And for that, they need all the info they can get.
So it's about understanding why it happened, not just what happened.
Exactly. And sometimes understanding the why means taking a really close look at the equipment itself.
That's what I was thinking. What happens to the equipment involved in a mishap?
Sometimes it gets shipped to the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, NEDU for short. They have amazing facilities and a whole team of experts who can figure out exactly what went wrong.
So they're not just reading reports, they're actually getting hands-on with the gear.
Yep. They can run tests, simulations, even take the equipment apart to see if there was a problem with the design or a manufacturing defect, or maybe it was a maintenance issue.
It's like CSI, but for diving equipment?
Pretty much. But the goal isn't to play detective and find a culprit. It's to make diving safer for every single diver out there.
And speaking of keeping divers safe, we touched on personal dive logs earlier, how they can be used to protect the diver's well-being. But those logs must also be important for, like, tracking their experience and qualifications, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. A personal dive log is like a detailed resume for a diver's entire career. Every dive, every qualification they earn, every piece of specialized equipment they're trained to use, it all goes in there.
So it's this living document that grows with the diver.
Exactly. And that info is super important for things like promotions, getting assigned to specialized teams, even getting paid more.
So those logs aren't just about safety, they're about recognizing and rewarding a diver's skills.
Absolutely. It's like a whole picture of what a diver can do. Helps the Navy make smart decisions about where to put them, how to best use their skills.
That's something I hadn't thought about before. Makes sense, though, especially in a job as demanding as diving.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then there's reporting equipment issues. We talked about the failure analysis reporting, or FAR, system earlier, but it's worth going a little deeper.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's so special about this FAR system?
What's cool is anyone can submit a FAR. It's not just divers. Supervisors, technicians, support personnel, anyone who sees a potential problem with the equipment, they're encouraged to speak up.
That's awesome. It creates this feeling that everyone's responsible for safety.
You got it. And those reports, they don't get ignored. They trigger a whole review process to figure out what's causing the problem and how to fix it.
So it's not just a quick fix. It's about preventing the problem from happening again, maybe even improving the equipment itself.
Exactly. Which brings us back to the Navy's overall philosophy when it comes to diving logs and reporting. Continuous improvement.
Always learning, always getting better, making diving as safe as possible.
You got it. It's a proactive system that never stops evolving, always looking for ways to minimize risks and maximize safety for everyone who goes underwater.
We've been so focused on how these systems work, but it's important to remember that it's all about protecting the people who are actually doing the diving, putting their lives on the line.
You said it. Those logs and reports, they're not just pieces of paper. They represent a commitment to safety, dedication to always improving, and, a deep respect for the courage and skill of those divers.
Well said. Now, we've covered a lot about the types of hazards divers face, but what about some specific examples? Real-world scenarios that show how important these reporting systems really are.
Okay, let's take a classic example. A diver accidentally exceeding their depth limit. It happens, right? Maybe they're caught up in the excitement of exploring a shipwreck, and they go a little deeper than they're supposed to.
Yeah, I can see that happening. It's easy to get caught up in the moment.
Exactly. But luckily, in this scenario, the diver's buddy is paying attention and notices the depth gauge. Alerts the diver, they come back up to the proper depth, no harm done.
So it's a close call, but everything's okay. End of story.
Not quite. That incident, even though nothing bad happened, is still a near miss, and it needs to be reported.
Really? Why report something that didn't have any consequences?
Because it's a chance to learn. By reporting it, the dive team, maybe even the whole diving community, can learn from it.
Okay, I see the value in that. But what can you learn from a near miss like that?
Well, for one, it reminds everyone how important communication and buddy checks are during a dive. Got to be vigilant about those depth gauges, stick to the dive plan.
Don't get complacent, even if it seems like a routine dive.
Right, but it goes deeper than that. By analyzing the incident, the dive team might figure out why the diver went too deep in the first place.
Like, maybe they were distracted by something cool on the seafloor, or there was a stronger current than they expected.
Exactly. And once they know those contributing factors, they can come up with ways to prevent them from happening again.
So they could implement a stricter buddy check system or adjust their dive plan to account for potential currents.
You got it. The point is, near misses, even though they don't result in an accident, they can still show you weaknesses in your procedures, potential hazards you might not have noticed otherwise.
I'm starting to see how those near-miss reports are just as important as mishap reports. They both contribute to that culture of continuous improvement.
Exactly. And don't forget about reporting equipment issues, even if they seem minor. Remember that FR system where anyone can submit a report if something seems off with the gear?
Yeah, the one where anyone can flag a potential problem.
Right. And those reports, even if they seem small at first, they can uncover bigger problems that are lurking underneath.
Okay, give me an example. A seemingly small equipment issue that turned out to be something more serious.
Let's say a diver notices their depth gauge is reading a little deeper than their buddies. It's just a small difference, maybe a foot or two, but still, something's not right.
So they submit a FAR even though the gauge seems to be working okay for the most part.
Yep. And that report kicks off an investigation. Technicians take a closer look, and what do they find? It's not just a calibration issue. There's a tiny leak in the pressure sensor.
Okay, that's definitely more serious. A leak in the pressure sensor could mean inaccurate readings, which is bad news for a diver.
Exactly. And that's why even those little equipment issues need to be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly.
So it's about being proactive, knowing that even small problems can be signs of bigger issues.
That's it. And that proactive approach goes beyond equipment. It includes the whole diving environment, things outside the diver's control that can still affect their safety.
Okay, let's talk about those external factors. What kind of things are we talking about?
Picture this. A dive team is getting ready to go in near a pier that's under construction. Cranes are swinging, boats are coming and going, all kinds of activity near the dive site.
Sounds a little chaotic for a dive.
It can be. And in this case, even if the dive team's gear is working perfectly and they're following their dive plan, they're still at risk because of all that stuff going on around them.
So what can they do to stay safe in a situation like that?
Communication is key. They need to be talking constantly with the surface support team who are keeping an eye on everything from above.
And the surface support team needs to know the dive plan inside and out, be ready to jump in if something unexpected happens.
Exactly. They might have to redirect boat traffic, tell the construction crew to hold off, even call the divers back up if things get too risky.
It's a team effort, everyone working together to keep the divers safe.
That's the key. It's about being aware of everything that's going on, not just the divers themselves, but everyone involved in the operation.
This is all really fascinating. All these pieces, the logs, the reports, the investigations, they all fit together to create this, safety net that's always evolving.
You got it. And at the center of it all is a huge respect for how dangerous diving can be and a commitment to keeping those divers safe.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners a pretty good look into the world of Navy diving logs and reports. It's complicated, but it clearly works.
Definitely. But there's always more to learn.
That's true. And I bet the Navy's diving program is going to keep changing as new technology comes along and new challenges pop up.
Oh yeah, it's a field that's always pushing the limits, exploring what's possible underwater.
Well, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing, the human element. We've talked a lot about rules and equipment, but it's the divers themselves who are making the decisions, taking the risks.
Absolutely, and that's why the Navy puts so much emphasis on training, experience, and personal accountability.
So it's not just about having the right gear and following the rules. It's about having the knowledge, the skills, and the judgment to make good decisions in a really challenging environment.
You said it. A good diver isn't just someone who can operate the equipment. It's someone who can assess risks, handle changing conditions, make smart choices under pressure.
And that's where experience comes in. The more dives you've done, the better prepared you are to deal with the unexpected.
For sure. Experience is gold in diving, and the Navy knows it. They've got this whole qualification system to make sure divers are properly trained and have enough experience before they do more challenging dives.
So it's a gradual process, building up to those more complex tasks.
Exactly. It's all about building competence and confidence over time, making sure divers are ready for whatever they might encounter underwater.
And I'd imagine personal accountability plays a huge role in all of this. Divers need to be responsible for their own choices and actions.
Absolutely. The Navy really instills that sense of personal responsibility in its divers. They emphasize that you're ultimately responsible for your own safety and the safety of your team.
So it's not just about following orders, it's about understanding the risks, making smart choices, and owning those choices.
Exactly. And that sense of personal accountability is in everything they do, from keeping meticulous records in their dive logs to being willing to report near misses and equipment issues.
It's like they've built this culture where everyone's responsible for safety.
That's exactly it. Shared responsibility from the newest diver to the most experienced, from the folks who maintain the equipment to the commanders making the big decisions.
This whole system is impressive. The Navy clearly put a lot of thought into building a diving program that puts safety first.
They did. And it really shows how dedicated and professional the Navy's divers are, embracing this safety culture and making it their own.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything when it comes to Navy diving logs and reporting.
We've definitely hit the main points. But remember, there's always more to learn.
That's true. And I'm sure the Navy's diving program is going to keep evolving as new technologies emerge and new challenges pop up.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic field, constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible underwater.
Well, before we close out this deep dive, I want to take a moment to recognize all the incredible work that Navy divers do, facing those incredible challenges and risks every time they suit up. It's inspiring, really.
I couldn't agree more. They are an amazing group of men and women embodying courage, skill, and dedication to serving their country.
And the systems we've been talking about today, the logs, the reports, the investigations, they're all there to support those divers, make sure they can keep doing what they do as safely as possible.
That's right. It shows how committed the Navy is to its drivers, creating a safety culture that's truly top-notch.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a pretty thorough understanding of the world of Navy diving logs and reporting. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with something to think about. All right, so we just covered how the Navy handles those near misses, but you mentioned there are specific steps they take when a reportable mishap actually happens. What's that process like?
Well, as I said earlier, the first thing is to secure the equipment. Super important to keep everything exactly as it was when the mishap occurred. Absolutely no tampering allowed. Got to preserve everything for the investigation. No one touches it until those investigators arrive.
Yeah, I can see why that'd be crucial. You don't want anything to get messed up or moved. What's the next step?
Immediate reporting. Time is of the essence, They've got to use the Web-Enabled Safety System, or WESS, for that. Gets the information up the chain of command right away, make sure everybody's aware of the situation as quickly as possible.
Okay, so they get the word out fast. But what exactly does that first report include?
It's got all the basics. The date, time, location, the type of dive they were doing, who was involved, a description of what happened leading up to the mishap, and then a detailed account of the mishap itself.
Okay, so it lays out the basic facts, but that can't be the end of it, right? There's got to be a more thorough investigation after that.
You're absolutely right. That initial report, it's really just the starting point. They also have to prepare a much more comprehensive written report. It goes into every detail imaginable.
Every detail? Like, what are we talking about here?
Think witness statements, photos, diagrams. They even have to include the weather and water conditions. Anything and everything that might even be remotely relevant goes into that report.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Why go to all that trouble? It seems like a ton of work.
Oh, it definitely is. But remember, the Navy's goal isn't to point fingers or assign blame. They want to learn from these incidents and prevent them from happening again. And to really understand what happened, they need all the information they can get their hands on.
It's about figuring out why something happened, not just what happened.
Precisely. And sometimes figuring out that why means taking a close look at the equipment, like really close.
That's what I was thinking about. What happens to the equipment after a mishap?
Well, in some cases, it actually gets shipped to the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, NEDU for short. They have top-notch facilities and a whole team of experts who specialize in this stuff. They can really figure out what went wrong.
So they're not just looking at reports, they're getting hands-on with the actual equipment.
Exactly. They can run tests, simulations, even tear the equipment down to its individual components. They can see if there was a design flaw, a manufacturing defect, or if it's just a simple maintenance issue.
It's like a CSI episode, but for diving equipment.
That's a pretty good analogy. But again, the goal isn't to find someone to blame. It's to figure out how to make diving safer for everyone.
And speaking of making diving safer, we talked earlier about those personal dive logs and how they help protect a diver's well-being. But those logs must also be useful for keeping track of experience and qualifications, right?
Absolutely. It's like a personal dive log is like a detailed resume for a diver's whole career. Every single dive goes in there, every qualification earned, every piece of specialized equipment they're trained to use.
So it's like a living document, grows and changes right along with the diver's career.
Exactly. And this information can be really important for a lot of things, like getting promotions, getting assigned to special teams, even getting paid more.
So it's not just about safety, it's also about recognizing and rewarding a diver's skills and expertise.
You got it. It really gives a complete picture of what a diver is capable of doing, helps the Navy make informed decisions about where to assign them, how to best use their talents.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that aspect before. It makes sense, though, especially for a job as challenging as diving. You want to be sure they have the experience.
Absolutely. You want the best people for the job. And then there's reporting those equipment issues. We touched on the failure analysis reporting, or FIR system earlier, but I think it's worth exploring a bit further.
Okay, I'm listening. What's so special about the FAR system?
Well, the really cool thing about it is that anyone can submit a FAR. It's not just limited to the divers themselves. Supervisors, technicians, support personnel, anyone who spots a potential issue with the equipment, they're encouraged to speak up.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. It really creates this culture of shared responsibility for safety.
It does. It shows that everyone has a stake in making sure things are done right. And these reports, they're not taken lightly either. Every single one triggers a thorough review process to figure out what caused the problem in the first place and how to fix it.
So it's not just about a quick fix. It's about preventing that problem from happening again, maybe even improving the equipment design in the long run.
Exactly. It's all about that bigger picture. And that brings us back to the core of the Navy's approach to diving logs and reporting. It's all about continuous improvement.
Always learning from experience, both good and bad. Always finding ways to make diving safer for everyone.
You got it. It's a proactive system that never stands still. Always looking for ways to minimize those risks and maximize safety for everyone who ventures underwater.
You know, we've been so focused on the nuts and bolts of how these systems work. It's important to remember that it's all about protecting the people who are actually out there doing the diving, putting themselves at risk.
Couldn't agree more. Those logs and reports, they're more than just pieces of paper. They represent a real commitment to safety, a dedication to continuous improvement, and a deep respect for the courage and skill of those divers.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details, but ultimately it's all about the people.
It is. And those systems, they're there to support those divers, make sure they can continue to do their job as safely as possible.
We've covered a lot of ground, talked about the types of hazards divers face, and how the Navy uses logs and reports to learn from those incidents. But can you give us some more specific examples, real-world scenarios that really illustrate how important these reporting systems are?
Sure. Let's start with a classic example, a near miss involving a diver exceeding their depth limit. It's something that can happen to even the most experienced diver. Maybe they're a little too focused on exploring a shipwreck and they accidentally venture a few feet deeper than they're supposed to.
Yeah, I can see that happening. It's easy to get caught up in the moment.
Exactly. But fortunately, in this scenario, their dive buddy's paying attention and catches it on the depth gauge. They alert the diver and they ascend right back up to the proper depth. No harm done.
So it's a close call, but ultimately everything turned out fine. End of story. Right.
Not so fast. Even though nothing bad happened, this incident is still considered a near miss. And near misses, they need to be reported.
Why? What's the point of reporting something if it didn't actually have any negative consequences?
Because it's an opportunity to learn. By reporting this near miss, the dive team and potentially even the entire diving community can learn from it.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But what exactly can be learned from a near miss like that?
Well, first of all, it emphasizes the importance of those constant communication and buddy checks during a dive. It reminds everyone to be vigilant about monitoring their depth gauges and to always stick to the dive plan.
Don't get complacent, even if it seems like a routine, easy dive.
Right, but it goes deeper than that. When the dive team analyzes this incident, they might be able to identify some factors that contributed to the diver exceeding their depth limit in the first place.
Like maybe they got distracted by something interesting on the seafloor, or maybe the current was stronger than they anticipated.
Those are great examples. And once they identify those factors, they can then take steps to mitigate those risks in future dives.
They could implement a more rigorous buddy check system, maybe even adjust their dive plan to account for those potential currents.
Exactly. The takeaway here is that even though near misses don't result in an accident, they can still point out weaknesses in procedures, identify those potential hazards that might otherwise go unnoticed.
I'm seeing how those near-miss reports are just as important as the mishap reports. They're both contributing to that overall culture of continuous improvement.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the importance of reporting those equipment issues, even if they seem minor. Remember the failure analysis reporting, or FAR system. Anyone can submit a report if something seems off with the gear.
Yeah, the one we talked about where anyone can flag a problem if they see one.
Right. And those reports, even if they seem insignificant on the surface, Sometimes they can uncover much bigger issues.
Okay, I'm curious. Give me an example of a seemingly minor equipment issue that actually turned out to be something much more serious.
All right, let's say a diver notices that their depth gauge is reading just slightly deeper than their buddy's gauge. Yeah, just a small discrepancy, maybe only a foot or two, but still, it raises a red flag.
So they go ahead and submit a FAR, even though the gauge seems to be working okay overall.
Exactly. And that report triggers an investigation. Technicians take a closer look at the gauge, and you know what they find. It's not just a calibration issue. There's a very subtle, very small leak in the pressure sensor housing.
Okay, yeah, now it's starting to sound more serious. A leak in the pressure sensor, that could lead to inaccurate readings, which could obviously have serious consequences for a diver.
Exactly. And that's why those seemingly minor equipment issues, they can't be ignored. They need to be taken seriously and fully investigated.
It's about being proactive, recognizing that even small problems can be indicators of much bigger issues.
You got it. And that proactive approach, it goes beyond equipment too. It encompasses that whole diving environment, those external factors that can also have a huge impact on safety.
Okay, external factors, like what are we talking about here?
All right, picture this. A dive team is gearing up to enter the water near a pier that's under construction. There are cranes operating, boats coming and going, just all sorts of activity happening around the dive site.
Sounds like a pretty hectic environment to be diving in.
It can be. And in this scenario, even if the dive team's equipment is working perfectly and they're following their dive plan to the letter, they're still at risk because of all that activity going on around them.
So what can be done to reduce those risks in a situation like that?
Communication is key, as always. That dive team needs to be in constant contact with their surface support team, who are up above, monitoring the situation from a different vantage point.
And that surface support team, they need to know that dive plan inside and out, be prepared to act quickly if something unexpected happens.
Exactly. They might need to redirect boat traffic, maybe have the construction crew pause their work for a bit, or even call the divers back up to the surface if things start to get too risky.
It's a real team effort. Everyone working together, watching out for each other to keep those divers safe.
That's right. It highlights just how important situational awareness is, not just for the divers themselves, but for everyone involved in the operation. Got to have all eyes on deck, so to speak.
This is all really fascinating. It's like all these pieces, the logs, the reports, the investigations, everything, they all come together to create this culture of safety that's constantly evolving and improving.
You've got it. And at the heart of it all is a deep respect for just how dangerous diving can be and an unwavering commitment to the well-being of everyone who's brave enough to venture into the underwater world.
I love that. It's easy to get lost in all the technical details, but ultimately it's all about protecting those divers and making sure they can do their job as safely as possible.
That's what it's all about. It's about recognizing those risks and taking every possible step to mitigate them.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of giving our listeners a good look at the world of Navy diving logs and reporting. It's definitely a complex system, but clearly it's been carefully designed over many years, all with the goal of keeping those divers safe.
It's a system that's always evolving, always looking for ways to improve, incorporating new technologies and lessons learned. It's never truly finished.
Before we move on, though, there's one more important aspect of this whole system I want to touch on, the human factor. We've talked a lot about procedures and equipment, but at the end of the day, it's the divers themselves who are making those split-second decisions, taking those risks.
That's a crucial point. And that's why the Navy puts so much emphasis on training, experience, and personal accountability in their diving program.
So it's not just about having the right gear and knowing the rules. It's about having the knowledge, the skills, and the judgment to make the right call in a challenging and often unpredictable environment.
You got it. A good diver isn't just someone who can operate the equipment. It's someone who can assess risks, adapt to changing conditions, and make smart decisions under pressure.
And that's where experience really comes into play, right? The more dives you have under your belt, the better prepared you are to deal with those unexpected challenges.
Absolutely. Experience is priceless in diving, and the Navy knows that. That's why they have such a rigorous qualification system in place. They want to be sure that their divers are properly trained and have the necessary experience before they take on those more challenging dives.
So it's a gradual process, kind of easing them into those more complex tasks as they gain experience.
Exactly. It's all about building competence and confidence over time, making sure that the divers are ready for whatever they might encounter down there in the depths.
And I would imagine that personal accountability plays a huge role in all of this. Divers need to be responsible for their own actions and the decisions that they make.
Absolutely. The Navy instills a very strong sense of personal responsibility in all of its divers, emphasizing that they are ultimately responsible for their own safety and the safety of their team.
So it's not just about following orders, it's about understanding the risks, making informed decisions, and owning up to those decisions.
Exactly. And that sense of personal accountability, it's woven into everything they do, from meticulously recording every dive in their logbooks to willingly reporting those near misses and equipment issues.
It's about creating this environment where everyone feels responsible for safety.
That's it. It's a shared responsibility from the newest diver all the way up to the most experienced, from the people who maintain the equipment to the commanders who are making those final decisions. It takes everyone working together.
This whole system, it's really quite impressive. The Navy has obviously put a lot of thought and effort into creating this diving program that really puts safety front and center.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to the dedication and professionalism of the Navy's divers that they've truly embraced this culture of safety and made it their own.
Well, I feel like we've covered pretty much everything there is to know about Navy diving logs and reporting.
We've certainly touched on all the key elements, but there's always more to explore, more to learn.
That's true. And I have no doubt that the Navy's diving program will continue to evolve and adapt as new technologies emerge and new challenges arise.
Oh, for sure. It's a field that's constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the underwater world.
Well, before we bring this deep dive to a close, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all the incredible work that Navy divers do, the challenges they face, the risks they take every single time they suit up. It's truly inspiring.
Couldn't agree more. They're an amazing group of men and women, full of courage and skill, and deeply committed to serving their country.
And all the systems that we've talked about today, the logs, the reports, the investigations, they're all there to support those divers and make sure that they can do their jobs as safely as possible.
Exactly. It shows how much the Navy values its divers, creating a culture of safety that's second to none.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a pretty thorough look at the world of Navy diving logs and reporting. But before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. We've spent this deep dive really getting into all those systems the Navy has in place to keep divers safe. But what about the equipment itself? We know they've got some pretty advanced gear. How does that factor into the whole safety equation?
Well, that's where that failure analysis reporting system we talked about, the FAR system, really comes in. Think of it as a direct line between the divers using the equipment and the engineers who design and maintain it.
So if a diver finds a problem, anything that seems off with their gear, they can report it, even if it seems like a small issue.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be a major malfunction. Maybe a regulator's not working quite right or a gauge seems a little off. If it raises a concern, report it.
And those reports don't just get filed away, do they?
Absolutely not. Depending on what's reported, they might pull that piece of equipment from service immediately, and then boom, a full-blown investigation is launched.
And sometimes that investigation includes sending the equipment to those experts at the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, right? NEDU.
You got it. NEDU's got the facilities, the expertise. They can really get to the bottom of things. They can simulate all sorts of diving conditions, push the equipment to its limits, figure out exactly what happened and why.
Leaving no stone unturned. But it's not just about fixing that one piece of equipment, right?
Nope. The goal is to make the overall design better, more reliable, not just for that one piece of gear, but for all the equipment used in future dives. Make it as safe as humanly possible.
It's pretty amazing, this whole system, but it makes you wonder, did the Navy always have such a detailed, meticulous approach to diving safety?
You know, it's been a long journey. In the early days of military diving, safety practices weren't nearly as advanced.
I bet there are a lot of tough lessons learned along the way.
Yeah, unfortunately. But over time, as diving technology got better and the missions got more complex, the Navy realized they needed a more systematic approach to safety.
And that's how all those logs, reports, investigation procedures, all of that evolved, right? Building a safety culture, one incident, one report, one lesson learned at a time.
Exactly. And it's still evolving. The Navy's always looking for ways to improve, always learning from other diving organizations, adopting new technologies.
This has been a fascinating look behind the curtain, really. We've seen how all the pieces fit together, the meticulous record keeping, the detailed reports, the constant striving for improvement, all adding up to a culture that puts safety first.
And that culture, it goes beyond just diving. Those principles, they can apply to any field where safety is critical.
Absolutely. Whether you're a pilot, a surgeon, even someone who loves to go hiking, you can learn from the way the Navy approaches diving safety.
It's all about preparation, awareness, and that constant drive to do things better, safer.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge. Think about the systems and procedures in your own field, whatever it is you do. Are there areas where you could be more proactive about safety? What can you take away from the Navy's approach and use it in your own work, your hobbies, your life?
It's a great question to ask yourself.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, safety is everyone's responsibility.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of knowledge.